An imbalance between rich and poor is the oldest and most fatal ailment of all republics. Patriarch. Whoever oppresses the poor shows contempt for their maker, but whoever is kind to the needy honors God. Proverbs 14:31. History is written by the rich, so the poor get blamed for everything. Jeffrey D. Sachs. If anyone has material possession and sees a brother or sister in need and has no pity on them, how can the love of God be in that person? Dear children, let us not love with words or speeches, but with action and truth. 1 John 3:17. Nothing that you haven't given away will ever be truly yours. C.S. Lewis. Woe to those who make unjust laws, to those who issue oppressive decrees, to deprive the poor of their rights and withhold justice from the oppressed of my people, making widows their prey and robbing the fatherless. What will you do on the day of reckoning when disaster comes from afar? To whom will you run for help? Where will you leave your riches? Isaiah 10:1-3. Let's talk about shaming the poor and lunch money. Welcome to Heresy and Hearsay, a podcast to reclaim faith through a political context. I'm Reverend Barney, and you can follow me on Twitter at SethRothII. You can follow the show on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and any podcast catcher. Just look for Heresy and Hearsay. Please like, share, follow, and subscribe to us. Also give us a review. That helps others find us. I'll be doing this again solo once again. But as always, you can find my partner and better half of the podcast, September, on Twitch and Twitter at 9of12. That's NINEOF12. And you can hear her on Geek Grills and Trust Your Podcast. Heresy and Hearsay has a Patreon site where you can find it at patreon.com/Heresy and Hearsay. Heresy and Hearsay, wow, my Southern just came out, where you can visit to help us. Just $2 a month goes a long way to help us make this humble show. You can also contribute with bits in Twitch or subscribe for free using your Amazon Prime. So, first a little house cleaning before we get to the topic. September is still recovering from her voice surgery. She is getting stronger daily, but I will be doing this week's and next week's show by myself. Hopefully she'll be back in August and start recording with us again. But right now her voice is still a little weak and she can't use it a lot. And if she uses it too much, it'll scar what they've done and it'll just defeat the entire purpose of the operation. So she'll be back. Our prayers are with her and that she'll recover soon. I'm recording for those in real time that can't actually see me, but I'm recording at 1 a.m. on a Thursday morning, Wednesday night. I've been dealing with a bit of depression. I've discussed that in the past on the show. I do have depression and it's been overwhelming, but I finally am climbing over it. And so I wanted to get this podcast out this week because I think it's important. September informed me that NPR, one of their shows, discussed this earlier this week. And so I was looking over this idea Sunday night, working on this and stuff like that, and this came to me. So I think this is a relevant thing. The main focus is going to be on lunch money. More importantly, it's going to be on what school districts are doing to kids who have debt. So let me give a bit of context in my life. When I was in school, especially the early elementary, K through 4, I was in a small community. It wasn't even a town, it was just a community that was extremely poor. It was not uncommon for kids to come to school with holes in their pants or clothes, wearing the same clothes 2 and 3 days at a time. They would be clean for the most part. There were some that didn't even have real running water that came to school, that did the best they could that way. Um, there were a lot of poor kids out there, and a lot of us was on either free or reduced lunch. Now, I can tell you back in my time, though this is nearly 40 years of trying to remember, but I was on reduced lunch. And so basically what would happen is at the beginning of the week, I would go into the office or give it to my teacher, depending on if my teacher actually cared or not. There are a few teachers that weren't very helpful, but most of the teachers understood. And I would go to the office and I would pay, and I would get these little green tokens that would pay for my lunch for the week. And I think it was a couple of bucks, maybe two or maybe three. I don't think it was much more than that. And I would have lunch that way. Sometimes my father would make enough money to where they could pack me a lunch. So I would take my lunch to school. But a lot of times that was, that's how I got my lunch, was there. I remember, I think it was my fourth grade year, they installed a soda fountain. And I remember it was about every 2 weeks we would scrape up a few pennies here, a nickel there, and I think it was like 50 cents at most, but I think it was a quarter. And we would scrape out enough money to where once every 2 weeks, sometimes once a week, depending on the season, because my father at the time was a chimney sweep. And summers were a bit lean, or falls and winter was much more profitable because he worked many more hours. I would be able to get a soda once a week. But for the most part, it was a lot of hot lunches that were out of cans that were heated up, or they weren't even frozen. Occasionally, we get hot dogs or hamburgers. The big one I remember the most, the one that always stuck with me, and I think this happened quite a number of times a month because we were in a poor school district in a poor area, so they didn't have a lot of money for food either. To feed us, and I know I was not. There were there were times when they had like two sections where dollar bills would go, because the meals were like maybe a buck a week, a day, where the dollar bills would go. That was just full of the green tokens, and I think they separated the green tokens from the free lunch, and because the kids who got free lunch would get a different green token. But they were full of those green tokens by the time, the sixth graders, because this was a junior high system at the time. So, that being said, I spent a lot of time, I spent many of my former years with a reduced lunch. So this hits me hard. This is why when I read about this, I had heard about one story. I didn't know it was so prevalent. I didn't know it was so intrinsic. And it's gotten so bad. But these stories of shaming these kids, and I'll be posting links of and a lot of it comes from CNN, because I went down the rabbit hole of links, and there were so many stories that had happened over the past 6 months of this stuff going on. And I've been so busy with the Trump stuff that I completely miss the local stuff sometimes. None of this stuff is happening in North Carolina that I'm aware of. If we are having this, please message me, let me know. We will do a follow-up on this, especially as school is starting up. But the thing is that there are so many schools, Pennsylvania, Rhode Island, Michigan, so many of these different stories are going around. There is a story of in one district, they were trying to withhold diplomas for kids who were high school kids who were graduating because they had unpaid lunch debt. I'm not sure how. I don't have any children. This is again where September would help so much because she does have children. She give me some insight. But from what I understand, basically the kids pay on a weekly basis, or to be fair, from what I read and what I understand, it's a bit like prison. And for those of you who don't know what prison or jail is like, you can put money on your card, on your account in prison, and then you can order snacks or make phone calls. And if you don't have that, you barely get soap and shampoo, and you get the meals that they provide. This gives you extra meals or extra food or drink or whatever. But that's what it sounds like, is basically you put money on an account and then you're able to eat. And my thoughts on this are twofold. First off, I understand that school districts can't do things for free. They should. Lunch should be one of those things. You're there for 6 periods. That's 6 hours. Plus, if you're doing any extracurricular activities, I know when I was in high school, I went quite a mini hour past. Sometimes, I get there at 7 or 8 o'clock in the morning because my parents had to go to work, and school started at 8, and I didn't get out until 7 or 8 that night, because I would be doing band stuff, or I'd be doing plays, or to be part of the student council, or in my senior year, I was even part of a peer counseling group, all this kind of stuff. And I was also a member of the Fellowship of Christian Athletes. I was not an athlete myself, but I was a trainer for the football team my sophomore year and my junior year. My junior year I didn't do any of that, but my sophomore year I did that, and then I was also a trainer for the wrestling team at the time. And in junior high I tried to do wrestling and stuff like that, and so I was always involved in sports. And then in my junior year I really got involved in the band much more. I also got involved in drama. I was part of the student council. I was part of the poet society there. I was very active in high school. So I was there for 12 hours, and, you getting one meal, and having to pay for it. And we always, look, I'll be honest with you, I always complained about lunch food, and I'll still complain about about lunch food like that. It's what you do as a kid. But I'll be honest with you, sometimes that was the only food you got, for 12 hours at least, unless you pack something. They had vending machines, and I'm sure that was healthy for us, because they were vending machines for crackers and candy bars and sugary sodas. So, that's being addressed. But there are so many things that are not being addressed, and there are so many kids that are going hungry, or having to have a credit, or, on their account where where they're going into debt. There are some kids that have like a $500 debt at the end of their school year, and the thing is, times aren't easy for a lot of kids. I read off, like I said, Pennsylvania, Rhode Island, these aren't, rich areas to begin with. Now, there are some areas, and this was discussed in one of the articles, talking about how they can apply and basically get the school lunches all paid for. And there's like 2 school districts that currently get that, one of them being New York City. But the thing with that is that only 45% of all of the nation would qualify at that time. So even if they and a lot of times it's a lot of hoops and stuff, and the Trump administration has reduced the amount of money that the USDA can offer. And on top of that, and a lot of the way the law is written now, is that the local school districts can't use federal aid to pay off these debts. You know, and there are stories that go around of how there are, you know, shaming these kids. And look, I went through high school and I just listed off that I did a whole bunch of extracurricular activities and stuff, and I got picked on some, you know. But could you imagine being picked on because you're only getting a peanut butter and jelly sandwich that marks you, or that they're having to wear this band around their arm saying that they're in debt? You know, school is hard enough. It is a social disaster, you know, with bullying, and there's so many anti-bullying campaigns that going around, and then you've got these school districts that are going around basically shaming children, shaming kids into, you know, paying debt that they can't pay because they're kids. They're at school. They don't work unless they're in high school, and maybe they work a little. But on the same thing, they may be also handing over their paycheck to their family just so that the family can eat. I told you about when I was growing up and everything else. My parents and my brother at the time, who was not in school at the time, he's 5 years younger than I am. So my brother would be at home and they couldn't afford daycare or anything like that. We were barely making ends meet as it was. We raised our own garden, and we raised, you know, our own food. And a lot of times we ate that food. You know, that was the only fresh food, vegetables we could afford because we grew it ourselves. And at the time, there was a seed program that you could get into that would help pay for some of the seeds, you know. And understand this. Please understand this. My father was working, and my mother was taking care of a young child. My father was working his ass off, getting paid very little, you know. But he worked his ass off, and both my parents, through rich and poor, always tried to take care of us. We never had clothes that were falling apart. My father did the best he could. We would have good Christmases. A Christmas during that same time frame, I got an Atari 2600. They saved for an entire year when it first came out. I got it a year later. They would save for a year, putting dimes and nickels and quarters together and have big jars, and then they'd roll them up and go to the bank and then go and buy us Christmas presents. And they went out many times. My brother and mother, there were many times where they would share those little pizzas that you can get at, like, in our area, we have levels of grocery stores, what I call levels. You have kind of your low-end grocery store, and then you have your high-end grocery stores, like, you know, I don't want to say Trader Joe's, but like in our area, it's Publix and Harris Teeter are high-end, and then you've got kind of your middle, which is our buy low in the area, and then you got the low-end, which is Food Lion, and now of course you got Walmart, but Walmart doesn't do these. But there were these little, I guess Tony pizzas is the cheap Tony pizzas that you can get is the best equivalent I can give you. And they would be, and it, maybe, I don't know, maybe 6 inches, maybe 8 inches total. And they were like the school pizzas you would get when you were in school. Think of those. They would be a little bit bigger than those, not much. And she would split it with my brother, and then we'd eat tomato soup. And basically the tomato soup, she would have to extra water down because it would, especially if my father was home that particular day, to feed the three of them while I was in school getting a meal there. So that was a burden off of her that she didn't have to feed me as well, especially the really lean time. And so we managed, and our parents did the best they could. The story that tripped me, the story that really upset me the most was, it was a story that I read this. Oh, and this is CNN, so but it says Pennsylvania school district tells parents to pay their lunch debt, or their kids will go into foster care. I mean, really? Like I said, my parents were poor, and my parents did the best they could for us. But my parents never abused me and my brother. My parents never neglected us. They loved us, and they did the best they could. But the situation was horrible. And this was in the early 80s, and we were in a recession. We were, the inflation was through the roof, and nobody could buy anything at the time. It got a little bit better towards the when my father finally got a decent job, and we moved further south, which also means a lot more heat, but that's a whole nother story. But I grew up, and I grew up healthy. I grew up, a little a lot overweight, but I grew up healthy. My parents made sure I played, made sure I had enough food, and the best ability, and they went without. There were many times they would go without, to make sure me and my brother had what we needed to have a happy childhood, or the best childhood they could provide with the situation they were in. So, to threaten parents who are doing the best they can by saying, hey, you need to pay us money or else we're going to take your kids. What the hell? I mean, really, what the hell? How dare you? And in that article, and all of these articles will be posted on the Twitter and on the not the Twitter, I apologize, on the YouTube when I post it on YouTube, as well as on the podcast notes when they get up later this week or next. But the DSS was like, wait a minute. We're not going to be used like some kind of blunt weapon. That is not our purpose. Our purpose is to keep families together. And they blasted the school system too. It's like, how dare you use us like that? That's not what we're here for, and we're not going to go along with that. And it's not neglect. It's not. It's they can't pay that debt, but they're trying the best they can because their kids are in school, and the school should feed them. And there have been stories of anywhere from famous chefs or even not famous chefs, just people in the school district shelling out tens of thousands of dollars, because it's not just like 2 or 3 kids. They talk about how some school districts have debt from the previous year of $20,000 or more in debt from these kids. So even with inflation, that's still a huge number of kids that can't pay their lunch. And that should be a warning sign of how bad our system is. Because it's not one kid or 2 kids or their parents trying to take advantage of the system. That's not what it's about. That's not what this is about. This is not about them trying to take advantage of the system. This is about them, just trying to feed their kids the best they can. And sometimes you got to make a decision between electric at your house, depending on if you're in Pennsylvania or Rhode Island, especially in the wintertime, you got to pay for that, heat. And if you're in the South, you got to pay for that air conditioning, or your kids are going to drop dead. You're going to drop dead. One either freezing cold in the north or blistering heat in the summertime. So, and you're making a decision between paying your car note on probably a 10-year-old car that you had to get at a buy here, pay here kind of place that's gouging you with interest rates because they don't have any credit, because credit now rules our world. The poor, it is ridiculous on how much we blame the poor. And this just doesn't started with Trump. I grew up in the 80s. And one of the big things that is carried over from the Reagan administration was this thing called welfare queens, which is basically, it's a made up thing where there's these women in the projects who are driving around in Cadillacs and got all this kind of money and wearing fur and stuff like that because they're gaming the system. There are bad seeds no matter what. There are bad seeds who are rich. There are bad seeds who are poor. Though lately we've been noticing a lot of more bad seeds that are rich, but that's another, you know, the love of money. And are there people that use the system to their advantage? Sure, there are people that do that. There are people that will use any system to their advantage, whether they be rich or poor. But the majority of people who are poor, the majority of people who are struggling for no fault of their own. Sometimes it's a race system. Sometimes it's just class. Sometimes it's just that, you know, I live in an area that was heavily reliant on meal workers and meals. There, out of 100 meals that are running, there may be 10 or 9 that are running right now in this area. There are a few more starting to open back up. There are some that have been converted into, you know, apartment buildings or whatever. But majority, you can drive around and see where everything is, you know, where these buildings are rotting in some places. You just see them falling apart. You see that, you know, they haven't been used in 10, 20 years. You know, because of, you know, economic things, because of the trend, because of globalization. And I understand that, you know, you can't put that genie back in the bottle. As much as people want to, you can't. You can adapt and change and become something different or build something different. Textiles are not going to come back like they were. They will come back some. There'll be niches of wanting American only and stuff like that. It's more expensive, you know, shipping in the stuff and everything else, but there'll be niches where that'll come back, and there are some areas that are starting to have that happen. The economic recovery from 2008 was starting to hit its trend and starting to really show on the main street, though most of the whatever happened and Wall Street and the rich. But you're also starting to see it. You're also starting to see it with workforce and stuff like that. The other problem is that we don't have a unionized workforce. I'm in a state that is a right to work state. So many of the states in the South are, and that's why if you look at states that had strong unions versus the states that didn't, why the economic boom was more prevalent in the northern areas where they had unions versus the states that were controlled by people who didn't want unions. And it became kind of an oligarchy system at that point in those southern states, because at that point they did not have that leverage. Now, are there some unions in the southern states? There are, but all unions have been, have been basically union busting and have been broken down so much. Part of it is because of the globalization of our manufacturing, but part of it is also the fact that, you know, there has been a concerted effort on multiple presidential fronts, and I'm not just talking Republican. My father was not a fan of Clinton. Because of the fact that he didn't do a lot for unions. At least that's what he said. Again, I'm not. That would be, again, something September would be able to step in and correct if it's wrong, or give more enlightenment on. And I'm sorry, that's not my field, is the religion stuff. I do know enough about politics to be dangerous, as they say, but I'm not as entrenched as she is, and she really knows her stuff, and I'll be glad when she's back. I miss her. on these podcasts. Anyways, sorry, a little tangent there. But so unions have been decimated. You know, they're not the power they once were. They're not the strong house they once were. My father was part of a union, and it was because of that union that he had health care as good as a senator, which I'm grateful for. And that's something else I've discussed in the past about medical insurance and stuff like that. Is, you know, I went with both my parents sick for over 4 years or more, about 4 years or more. I was grateful for that, because if we didn't have that, I don't know what me and my brother's life would have been like. It would have been a hell of a lot different. That's for damn sure. But the poor, and here's the thing: it's not a modern thing either. And again, you know, I go back to this book quite often, because I think it's an important historical. It's an important history book, and it's a book that should be taught in schools. It should be right alongside the, other history books that are out there. Especially the curriculum. Nobody wants these books to be there, but they want this book is extremely important, and that's the people's history of the United States of America. But the poor have always been looked down upon or blamed or whatever. During wars, it was not uncommon that the rich, are supposed to pay for, or are supposed to go. But what they would do is they would pay, they would hire people to go in their stead, or they would pay a tax to avoid going to war, and not everybody could do that. And I'm not just talking about the Civil War, but there was the Spanish American War. There was the war with the American Mexican War. These kind of wars that were going on, and of course, then there was all of the stuff that was going on with the Native Americans at the time, and how they needed soldiers to handle that and stuff. And most of these kids were from poor families, and even today, the military, in a lot of cases, the only option for a lot of these kids to go to college. It is a huge thing for these kids to be able to go to college, but the only way to be able to go to college is by joining the military, because they can't get an academic or athletic scholarship. And it's, and that is built in our system. That's part of our zeitgeist. That's part of what we are. Zeitgeist is the wrong word. It's part of our identity. It's part of who we are, is that we put kids into war, and if you live if you live through one or two terms, you can then go to college. That was my father's way out of the poor that he came through, and he was poorer than me and my brother were. Was he joined the military? Most of his siblings joined the military. I think all but two, in fact, joined the military of his siblings. Now that I think about it, my uncle joined the military. My mother's side joined the military, partly because he knew he'd probably get drafted, so he joined the Air Force, and partly because of the simple fact that it was a way out, because they were poor too. I come from a family of poor, and there's been studies that have stated that there is no real American dream anymore, and there hasn't been for 30 years or better. That the class that you were born in, with some changes or some variants, is the class you die in. You don't ever move up a ladder. They talk about, in the 50s, the late 40s, 50s, and early 60s was the what a lot of people call the golden era. There were laws in place to avoid after the stock market crash in 1929, there were laws put in place to avoid that from happening. from stock markets crashing and runs on banks happening again. The downside to that situation is that those laws were eventually repealed, and we started our boom bust cycle again. And we've seen that. We've seen that multiple times. We're on a boom right now, and we're going to hit another bust. That's what the housing market was with, and they're starting to trade in those same things again. They're able to trade in those toxic assets, now, and they weren't able, because those laws have been weakened by Congress and by our current president. Those laws weren't very strong to begin with. So there was a lot of there's been a lot of stuff that has been woven into the fabric of America to keep the poor oppressed. But when you look at this current trend, it is more blatant than it's ever been. Was that little green token a badge of dishonor or whatever? Probably. If I was going to a school that was more affluent, if I was in a different area that had more money or whatever, probably. But the problem is that over half the kids were using those tokens, so wasn't nearly as seen. So to think that they would then want to openly shame kids, and these are kids, some of them in elementary school, some of them in high school, and in between, but these are kids that are just wanting to have a meal, just wanting to eat, so that they can go on to their day, because it has been proven by study after study that when kids go into school hungry, they can't focus. And if they stay hungry all day, of course they're going to do bad in school. There's been proven studies about this. I remember that there was a controversy several years ago about, I think it was a state senator, but someone or it might have been a representative, basically stating the fact that, her state, the state that she was in, was working, had a way for the poor kids to get lunch and breakfast during the summertime as well. And she stated, first off, why aren't the churches feeding these kids? Or maybe these kids could get a job. They get fed at McDonald's. First off, not everybody is 16 or older. Second off, not everybody would has transportation to get to a job because their parents are probably working. And, McDonald's will change their hours regularly. I've worked in fast food kind of environment, so I know that your hours are never set in stone. And one week you may be working to where your parents can take you to work, and the next week, your boss is having you come in at a different time, no matter what you say. And you can't get to work. But more importantly, why does that matter if they are working? Shouldn't it be our intrinsic duty to take care of our children? And if these children need food during the summertime because they don't get that opportunity, to eat for whatever reason, that we should feed them? We are a nation. That claims to be Christian. You hear it so much. And I will link this as well. There is a basically it's a website that has listing of all of the Bible verses that talk about taking care of the poor. And the Old Testament, which they love to preach at you about when it comes to gay marriage, or when it comes to abortion, or when it comes to, whatever that suits them. The amount and just the sheer level of the volumes and volumes of verses preaching against being bad, hurtful to the poor, of passing laws against the poor, or dishonoring the poor, or just treating them horribly. There's hundreds of verses. Dr. Reverend Barber talks about a Bible that you can get that is the poor person's Bible. It's basically a Bible talk that focuses on the verses about poverty, and he's also started his movement to help the poor, and this movement is to reclaim our government for moral reasons. He's the one who started Moral Mondays in North Carolina, and he's the one that has been at the forefront of trying to help our poor. Should churches help the poor? Absolutely. That's their main job. I never understood, and I still do not understand megachurches. I do not understand why a pastor can come out onto stage wearing a tailored fit silk suit in front of 10,000 people in an auditorium, when that auditorium can be used to feed and house poor people. I'm not saying that preachers should not have money, or should not, be able to live a decent lifestyle. But you yourself has supposedly devoted your life to God, and now you do not want, and now you have all the trappings of the rich. And Jesus said that it will be, and my interpretation of this is this. I am talking about the eye of a sewing needle, not the eye of the needle that they've worked into to get through a gate in a walled city. No, this is the eye of a needle, of a sewing needle. That it is more likely that a camel will pass through an eye of a needle than it will be for a rich person to see God. And while we're on this subject, and while we're on why Christians, above anybody else, should not look at rich people as an encouragement, the prosperity doctrine is a lie. God blesses people because they are good people. God blesses people because they are righteous people. God does not give you riches in this world. It has been stated over and over and over and over in the New Testament especially. Your riches are in heaven. So how can you, as a Christian, believe that because you are a Christian, and a good Christian, that you should also be rich, and those who are even better Christians should be rich? I do not. There are so many people out there, and you know what? I'll probably make this a two-parter at this point, because I really want to talk about the prosperity doctrine. So that's probably what we'll hit next week, but I wanted to touch on it a bit here. When you have reverends who claim to be men of God, and demand that their church and their followers buy them a new private jet. And I will definitely, and John Oliver does this great thing about it, and we will talk about this next week. But I will talk about that some, about John Oliver's take on the prosperity doctrine. But basically, how dare you use your power to that effect, that you are willing to milk and lie and cajole and say, if you do not send me money, then you're not going to heaven, because it's quote unquote seed money for your heavenly reward. You know what your heavenly reward consists of? How well you deal with others, how you treat others, how you help people who are in need. C.S. Lewis, and I quoted him earlier, but C.S. Lewis talks about in Mere Christianity that you should be wondering how you're going to pay everything. Because besides tithing and charity, that you should be able to, or besides helping your family out and tithing, that you should be giving the charity till it nearly hurts, till it nearly bleeds you. Because money is dangerous. Money is because you want more of it, because it is an addiction, just like so much other. And money and power come together. So I can't understand these reverends who have mansions and limos and private jets. My pastor at the church I used to go to, let me back up. So most churches that I am aware of, especially Baptist, but many other churches, affiliates, whether it be, they have a house that is part of the church property where their pastor at the time lives. My pastor lived at that house, the one at the church I used to go to. My pastor raised a child while living in the poorest parts of Africa. And not only was he preached, of course he did. His wife was a teacher. So she taught while they were there. She taught, the children in villages and stuff like that. But they would help build buildings, and they would help agriculturally. They would help in the farming and all that kind of stuff. They were missionaries, but they were the type that would stay in a community for a while. And they became part of that community, and they would help that community out. Even if not everybody converted, they still helped out the entire community. And they lived simply and basically. When they were living there, of course they had their own vehicles, and they were not the top of the line new vehicles. They weren't paid that much, and they never were paid that much. But they had a decent life. But they also gave to other charities. They also worked in the community still. They also, did all this stuff. It wasn't just them, they just didn't show up three times a week, and occasionally, talk to whoever would come to their home, because their home was always open to whoever needed to speak to them. You'd have to call and be like, hey, can I come over? I need to talk about a spiritual matter. They would prefer you not knock on the door at 3 o'clock in the morning, and more to the point, when Hurricane Katrina hit, and there were refugees, because that's what they were, after their homes were destroyed and leveled, and they were finally able to make it out of the city, they opened up that pastoral home to a family who needed a place to stay, and helped them find a car, and helped them find a job, and helped them find a place. That's what churches are supposed to do with their resources. They're supposed to help families. They're not supposed to build amusement parks. I live in North Carolina, and many of you probably don't know this if you're younger, but there used to be this thing called PTL. I think I'm sure I'm getting it wrong. Jim and Tammy Baker. And they were like the original hucksters of this new wave of evangelicals who would, and they were, especially, and Jim Baker, I thought he had gotten better, but no, he's still huckstering, because now he's selling survival food in these containers that last up to 30 years in case, we're overrun by Mexicans or whatever. But, it's a prepper's dream, these things. And, he's doing all this other stuff and everything, and he's gotten himself back into politics and stuff. But back in the day, they were raising money to build this luxury Christian resort. And basically, they embezzled, Jim Baker embezzled so much money, and he went to prison. And he has not been humbled, because he's doing it again. Because he's doing the same thing. Because the power of money is so intoxicating. And so these churches are so intoxicated by their own wealth that they don't do what they're supposed to do. Proverbs 22:9 says, "A generous man will be blessed, for he shares his food with the poor." You know, Isaiah is full of condemnations about how the rich took advantage of the poor. Isaiah 10:2, for example, to deprive the poor their rights, to withhold justice from the oppressed of my people, making widows their prey and robbing from the fatherless. The right in Isaiah 11:4, with righteousness he judges the needy, with justice he gives decision to the poor of the earth. He will strike from the earth with a rod from his mouth, and with the breath of his lips will slay the wicked. The poorest of the poor will find pasture, and the neediest will lie down in safety. But your roots will be destroyed by famine. It will slay your survivors. Isaiah 14:30. He talks about this constantly in Isaiah, about how about the poor have been mistreated, and we're doing it again. And this also ties into race. This also ties into immigration. How we are treating these poor kids, shaming these children, taking advantage of these children, making these children to be bullied, not only by children because they've been marked with some A, or what is it for poor it's P, or hungry with an H, basically sewn onto their clothes. But they're also bullied by their own school district, by the teachers who are supposed to help nurture these children to being adults. And all you're going to get is bitterness and hatefulness, because that's all they've been shown. And they don't believe in love, and they don't believe in charity and kindness. There are stories, and again, this will also be posted, of school workers, of lunch people being fired because they refused not to feed children. They were fired because they refused not to feed these children. And yet, these school districts are so concerned about their money, and so concerned about, the debt that these kids have, instead of being concerned about why there's the debt in the first place, of how they can help alleviate this debt, of what they can do with either the county commission or the city board or the city council, and finding a way to help these poor people so that they aren't having to send their kids with no food and no money to buy lunches. Maybe we should start thinking about helping these families out so that this doesn't happen, instead of shaming them or threatening to steal their children. Has that become the new thing for America? Is that if, you do anything slightly wrong, we're just going to steal your children away from you? Because that's why we have children in cages now, is because of the fact that, they were crossing the border illegally, so they don't have a right to their family. So these kids can't pay their lunch bill, so that they should be ripped away from their parents for the same reason, because that's what it comes out to be. That's what they're doing. That's what they're saying. That's what they're wanting you to believe, is that it's perfectly okay for us to take children, steal children away from their parents because their parents are poor. And this is something they've been wanting to do for a while. This is not the first time something like this has come up where they felt poverty is a child abuse when it's not. It's an abuse of the system against these people. Again, that's why I read that quote. I found that quote and I was like, well, that's pretty accurate. The rich people are trying to blame the poor people for everything, for all their problems, all their ailments, all their issues, when it's their own avarice and their own evil that is doing this. And then to threaten their children, and then to threaten their children, or to threaten their livelihoods as they've become adults by withholding their degrees so they're not considered high school graduates, or just shaming them in general. Representative Omar is coming up with a bill to stop this kind of stuff, and I hope this passes. I doubt it will, but I hope it does. But there are so many children that are suffering across this nation. Churches should be stepping up. They should read these articles and go, well, not in my neighborhood. This is not going to happen. We're going to make sure those kids are fed. We're going to raise money and make sure that we pay off these debts off these books. And we're going to make sure it's not just one kid or two, that all children pay that all their money is paid for, so that these kids can go to school and not have to worry about getting a lunch or getting a breakfast. The churches should get together. That's, if you want to be a Christian, you want to do something as a Christian, pay for children's, get that going in your church. Have your children and the friends of your child, and just somebody who is at the same school as they are, make sure they don't have to worry about lunch. Make that a big deal. Start a drive in the 1st of June when school starts letting out. Save up that money and then walk into those schools that are in your hometown and pay for every kid's lunch. That's what churches should be doing right now. Instead of paying millions of dollars so that this preacher in a fancy suit can tell you how to get to heaven. How you get to heaven is by doing good things and by treating the rich, by treating the poor with respect and dignity and helping them. That's how you get to heaven. That's how you get to heaven. If you are a Christian individual. If you're not a Christian individual, if you're some other faith, or if you're agnostic or an atheist, start a fund drive that way too. And what I would be okay with is if that the atheist and the pagan and the Jewish and the Buddhists and a district were able to gather up money, and the churches just sat back and did nothing, and they paid for the schools, and be like, this is what it's like to be a good human being. Because obviously, as Americans, we've lost our way as a Christian nation. I don't believe we're a Christian nation, by the way. But if so many on one side of the field is going to claim to be a Christian nation, be a bloody Christian nation. Stop shaming the poor. Take care of the poor. Stop shaming the immigrants. Stop shaming the elderly and women. Treat them with respect. Be good human beings. Help people out that don't have help. That's how you become a good person. Just to be a good person. That is the important thing right now. We're going to end right now. So next week, I want to talk about the prosperity doctrine and how it relates to politics, because there is a huge corollary there. If September is with me, we will do it. We will probably do in the news, and then we'll do that the following week. Because I would want her to do something not so stressed on her voice. And I'm sure she probably has some feelings about the prosperity doctrine. But if it's just me, I'll discuss the prosperity doctrine. And when she comes back, we'll probably hit some of these topics again later on down the road, because I'm sure there's some of these topics she would like to discuss. and give me more insight on her side. But as it stands right now, so that's one of the two things that'll happen, and hopefully after that, then we'll cover the how to talk to people on the other side, because I think that's a very important topic. I think that's very important for us to have that discussion. As we end, so let me start. I would like to start with our carrot and stick segment. I'm trying to keep that going. It was hard to find a carrot until yesterday. And I'm going to give props and praises where they're due. The Senate passed the 9/11 responder funding bill to 2090, which basically is forever, because that's 71 years down the road. So this is specifically designed for the first responders who are having medical issues, and that got passed. And Jon Stewart is elated and emotional and happy, and I'm happy too. I'm glad that was done. You know, Paul Ryan is a jackass, Mitch McConnell's a jackass, but at least that was done. At least that got through. And for those Republican senators that voted for that, I thank you immensely for doing the right thing on this matter. So you get the carrot this week. Stick. This was pointed out to me by September, and I'm not even going to say his name, but there is a Catholic priest, an Indian Catholic priest, and I mean Indian Catholic priest, that basically blames autism on sin, and calls autistic children animals. And there'll be 2 links for some of his wonderful speeches out there in the world. But basically, he says that if you're into homosexuality, or if you're addicted to porn, or, if you're sinful and then you create a child, that child is going to be the manifestation of your sin. And I have to say this. If that was the case, if sin created autistic children, or created children with mental disorders, or physical disorders, or whatever, why is Trump's children look and act semi-normal? I mean, they're not completely normal, but I'm just saying there is no causality, and it is sickening, especially considering the fact of how much a good amount of the Catholic Church has moved away from this kind of stuff to science. And they even believe that people are born homosexual. And that took a fight and a fight and a fight. But the Catholic Church believes that they're one of the few. But he's a Catholic priest. He should be on top of this. I have the Vatican II sitting on my book stand. On my bookshelf in the study, with my other political and religious texts. In fact, just to be fair, my Vatican II is sitting right next to my 3 books by Keith Olbermann. So, I figured it works well that way. It makes me happy, at least. But yeah, Vatican II talks about science and how important it is for science and science development. So, how dare you? How dare you? These children already have enough, and parents, there's already enough myth out there about autism, with anti-vaxxers who are basically trying to kill their children and ours too by not vaccinating their children, let alone, now you're going to say sin is a part of this. If that was true, which it is so not true, but if that was true, then every child would have autism or some other type of physical or emotional or mental disorder, because of the simple fact that according to the book we all believe in, sir, it says that every man falls short in the eyes of God, that we are all sinners. That we all, unless you have just came back from communion and you have done it, and you've done your confessions, and you have done your penance for your confession, and then immediately go to try to make a baby, everybody sins, from minor sins to major sins. Everybody sins. And because we sin, or because, according to the Bible, and everybody makes that mistake. So just because of that simple fact, that means every child would be that way. So how dare you, sir, add more myth and more mystic bullshit onto what is already a troubled thing when it comes to autism. And to call them animals, to call children animals, how dare you, sir? You get a stick. With that being said, thank you once again for joining us at Heresy and Hearsay. I am Reverend Barney. You can follow me on on Twitter at SethRothII. You can also find the show on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, podcast, as well as our website. Just Google us. Don't forget, $2 on our Patreon page can help this keep going. You can find my partner on Twitch and Twitter at 9 of 12. That's at NINEOF12. And you can hear her on the Geek Grills and Trust Your Cape podcast. Thank you for listening today, and bless your hearts.